Audrey Rose, and today we're going to be talking about the overall project of Anselm's Proslogion. We're going to be moving beyond the argument, the famous ontological argument, but critically, that is a phrase we receive mainly from Kant. We don't really find that in Anselm's work. If anything, it's an ontological project, which I would feel a little more sympathy toward using that language. But we really do have to understand what Anselm is doing in the Proslogion. I struggle to say that word, to forgive. But we have to understand what he's doing from the posture of a prayer. He opens chapter 1 with a meditation on who God is, and he's clearing his mind, and it's quite critical that for Anselm you can't really even approach God except from your knees. Now, we've already discussed the epistemological consequences of Anselm's work in Why Does Anselm's Ontological Argument Haunt Us? We can consider this a kind of part 2 to that, where we're going to be focusing more on the theology, the theological consequences. So, we have to understand that Anselm's going to make a few key moves here, and I think chapters 2, 3, and 15 are really important. So 2 is something than which nothing greater can be thought. 3 is God cannot even be thought not to exist, and then 15 is something greater than God is something greater than can be thought. Now, it can seem like 2, 3, and 15 are repeating the same idea, but there are actually subtle differences there that I think are very important. So, in chapter 2, God is something than which nothing greater can be thought. Chapter 3, though, is that God cannot not be thought. We would be tempted when trying to think something of which nothing greater can be thought. The great difficulty of that might tempt us to give up the effort. But then Anselm is telling us, well, no, you can't conclude from that difficulty of that effort that God doesn't exist. And he really emphasizes this as well. Well, Anselm really brings out the importance of chapter 3, also in chapter 15, where he says, God is something greater than can be thought. Well, you would conclude if you can't think of God, then therefore he must not exist. But Anselm has told us in chapter 3 that God cannot not exist. So 2 is going to define God as the greatest of all possible thoughts, basically. Chapter 3 is going to tell us that greatest of all possible thoughts cannot not exist. And then chapter 15 is going to say, oh, and by the way, whatever you think is the greatest of all possible thoughts cannot be it. So you have to keep pushing forward. So 2 gives us our target, the greatest of all possible greatest of all possible thoughts. Chapter 3 tells us that thought must exist, and that if we think it doesn't exist, we're not thinking it. And chapter 15 makes it clear that we have to keep going. So there's this forward movement. So if we can only think of God from a place of believing he is real, which would practically make us fall to our knees if we really took seriously who God was, from there, we would have to conclude that God does exist, and he can't not exist, as William Wilson will stress from chapter 3. Well, then chapter 15 is going to give us a reason to stay on our knees and to keep pushing forward. So all 3 of these almost kind of have a Trinitarian structure to them that keeps us advancing in the entire project of what Anselm is doing. He's not merely giving us an argument, but an entire structure by which to operate in and to consider the entire person of God and how that can lead us up to a joy of which can't not exist, which is ultimately where Anselm's project will end. If we take these three parts together, chapter 2, chapter 3, and chapter 15, there's a few implications to consider. I'm not sure if all of these follow, but there are some possibilities. So first, there's motivation to think of God. After all, he's the greatest of all possible thoughts, and who would not want to think that? Also, it would mean that we have to think of God in terms of God, therefore, not if God, then. There is no if God. God is a concept that exists. So it's either God, therefore, or nothing. You can't think of God in terms of ifness. The third implication would be we could think of God as, if we think of God as not existing, we are not thinking about God. We cannot not think of God is another possible implication. If we say this is too confusing, I don't want to think about it, we have uttered a practical impossibility. I mean, God is everything. If we are thinking about a thing. So there's this funny way in which we can't escape thinking about God, which we might be tempted to attempt, given the difficulty of thinking about God. What's also strange is the greatest possible thought we can think is not God, though it is most like God, given chapter 15. The best we can think is like God, which maybe is to be expected, given Genesis 1:3, where we're made in the image, 1:3, where we're made in the image and likeness of God. And there's also something interesting where it's not possible for us to think a thought which must exist, for only God must exist, and God cannot be thought, as we learn from chapter 15. So it's not possible for us to think necessary being, and yet it's also not possible for that necessary being not to exist, as we learn from chapter 3. So again, the epistemological uniqueness of God is really brought out in Anselm here, and as is the fact that we either have to take the whole case or can't take any of it at all. And ultimately, that is what Anselm wants to do. He wants to present an entire case of whom God must be and must be like, that we either have to take the whole of it or not take any of it. And yet the only way we can determine if we should take the whole of it or none of it is from our knees, so Anselm kind of has the board stacked against us, which is just fascinating, because I really think it highlights some truths about the nature of thinking that we don't always appreciate. So yeah, and there's also, it's kind of like God is an unthinkable entity that must exist, for it cannot be given thought by existence and is yet still a thing. God is the only unthinkable entity. It's just quite interesting. So, generally we can extend being to things by thinking about them, like this bookcase. I can extend it being by thinking about the bookcase. And in a way it is given being by my thoughts, because I organize it into meaning and I can organize it into conceptual frameworks. But regarding God, God is an unthinkable entity. But he is an entity. Just because you can't think him doesn't mean he doesn't exist. Everything else is an entity that is thinkable, and in a way must be thought to have full being, whereas God's being comes entirely from his entityness, per se, from his own being. He's the ground of his own being. All of this can be kind of brought out by chapters 2, 3, and 15, which is pretty wild. But again, it would be erroneous to miss Anselm's entire project, which I think can sometimes be missed. For section 2 of the paper, we're going to be talking about the question of, okay, so maybe Anselm has shown us that we can only think of God as real, or we're not thinking about God, but is the concept of God to itself internally consistent? Meaning, are there premises in it that cancel itself out? Because if so, then even if we can put 2, 3, and 15, those chapters together to create a very interesting epistemological situation, the concept of God will efface itself. Well, and again, yeah, sure, maybe Anselm kind of shows us that we have to take all of God or not. That's going to be his ultimate effort, I think, is to kind of outline what God must be to be, and we have to take the whole or can't take any of it all. That doesn't mean there still isn't room for debate about the particularities of God, but the overall concept to maintain internal consistency will have to follow, as Anselm puts it, or so he hopes to achieve. But again, if God can't make a rock, he cannot live, for example. If justice and grace cannot coincide without canceling each other out, on and on. If there is a failure for there to be internal consistency in the concept of God, well then, the greatest of all possible beings doesn't exist. It effaces. But very importantly, if we take seriously the idea that God can't not exist, that the greatest of all possible beings must exist, then when we encounter these theological paradoxes, we can't conclude from the very existence of these paradoxes that God must not be. In this way, what Anselm's argument accomplishes, his opening argument, is to change our disposition and orientation to all theological paradoxes regarding God. We can't simply encounter the paradox and say, well, that's it for God. Instead, we have to think with the paradox, not just dismiss God according to the paradox. And that's a very big move, and would actually help us work through all of these different theological problems. Now, the paper is going to give a micro map of the steps that he makes. There are little things like, for example, he explains how God cannot have a body but still perceive, because you can perceive with knowledge even if you don't have senses. God also created everything, so he has that intimate knowledge as part of his being. There's the part of how God can be omnipotent and still not be able to do everything, such as lie, because lie entails weakness. It's not a strength. So if we ask, can God tell a lie, or can God say lift a rock he cannot lift? Well, a rock God cannot lift would be a contradiction, and contradiction is a kind of weakness. And so for God not to be able to do a weakness would not take away from his omnipotence, because it's a weakness. Anselm's going to say that we can use speech in a manner to make it sound like God is incapable of doing something when we say he can't lie. But really, there is no power in lying, and therefore God's inability to do it does not mean he is not all-powerful. And similarly, he's going to talk about how God can be merciful and not feel sorrow in chapter 8. Chapter 10 is also 10 and 12. He's going to be talking about how God can be just and graceful. Which, a quick way to put it is if wickedness is relative to God's judgment, and only God knows what determines wickedness, then we can actually never say that God is ever merciful to the wicked, quote unquote, which would be a kind of contradiction, a problematic, maybe even immoral. Anselm will say something like, when God has mercy on us, he's judging us according to the goodness he puts in us, where when he gives us justice, a harsh judgment, he's judging our sin that we engage in. So he goes through that. He's going to talk about how God is not bound by space and time. And there's a few things too with that. So, coming up to chapter 15, where, again, God is something greater than can be thought, which would suggest that we cannot access God. There's an interesting movement that's going to occur. So Anselm establishes that God is not bound by space, that God cannot be thought, which would kind of, for one, suggest that we need to give up. I mean, if we can't think of God, what's the point? But again, we've been told in chapter 3 that God cannot not exist. And so that's interesting, because that kind of traps us in a way where we have to keep thinking about God, even though we cannot think about God, even though we can't fully capture God in our thoughts. And you see, what happens in 16, 17, and 18 is, for me, a section where it's almost like Anselm attempts to ascend toward God by his own power or by trying to seek him, but God is in an unapproachable light, and so he fails. Anselm fails, which I think we can view chapter 18 as a kind of failure. And, at the end of 18, Anselm kind of calls out, "What are you, Lord? What are you?" And we can start to see after this a kind of ascension. So as of 15, Anselm is trying to ascend toward God, because 15 is this kind of forward push where God is unthinkable, but yet you still have to try to think him. So there's a forward push to it. So Anselm tries, but then he fails. So now we can have a successful ascent where it's unveiled that we cannot ascend toward God, because what's interesting is, in a way, God is already with us, because he's not bound by space or time. So he's not separated from us. He's with us, but we are not in a place where we can fully grasp that. So God has to bring us to that place. But God has to bring us to that place, which means the ball is in his court. And there's a sense in which there's a kind of relative ascent, because we seem to ascend toward God, but really that's God pulling us toward him. So God isn't divided by space or time. And then there's this idea, chapter 23 almost for me is where it's clear that God is the Christian God. Up before chapter 23, you could arguably make a few adjustments, and the God Anselm's talking about would not necessarily have to be Christian, could be Allah. But 23 is where it's unveiled that you're talking about the Trinity, which is the Christian God. So there's this movement through Anselm's project toward an increasing particularization. And what's interesting about the Trinity is you're dealing with a many that is yet one, which, if God is a many that must be one, that is also one, that would suggest that it would be possible for us to somehow participate in God, because there's a multiplicity that is unified. Now, we can never be equivalent to God, say, for example, because we're bound by time. Even if we enter into an eternity, there was a time when we were bound by time, whereas God has always been unbound by time, so there'd be distinction. There'd always be levels of distinction between us and God, but there's a 23 suggests the possibility of participation in God, because God is not a unified sort of singularity that has no multiplicity in him. God actually unveils the possibility of multiplicity being one and unified. And also 24 is going to suggest how a unification of many goods is better than a single particular good. So there's also a part here, 23 through 25, that's going to kind of suggest that a God of whom is a trinity or multiplicity as a singularity is better than a God that was a many or a singular. And so the Trinity is going to be part of the internal consistency of God as the best of all possible beings. And then 26 we can see as an effort to make eternal bliss part of the internal consistency of who God is. So it all follows. There's this kind of movement where from the starting place that God is the best of all possible beings, and that being must be real, so we must think about God as real. From that, we have a movement of defending and maintaining the entire internal consistency of God and what God must be like, of which concludes with a eternal bliss, that the only God that can exist is one, of whom entails the possibility of participation and of whom is eternal bliss. And that's, that can be seen as Anselm's project. It's not merely the opening ontological argument, as Kant would have it put, but an entire project of what it means to think of God and what the concept of God can be put. Another way I'll call this the macro map of the Proslogion. Again, I'm not going to argue that this is what I'm going to describe here is exactly what Anselm was intending, but for me it kind of helps to think of it this way. We can say that chapter 1 is a meditation to prepare the mind for contemplating God, and then we have the first movement, 2 through 4, which is, to sum up, a way we can put this is, I cannot think you aren't real. I cannot think you aren't real. So then there's a meditation in chapter 5 on what God must be as the greatest of all possible beings, which determining these goals are necessary, like defining terms, for otherwise we wouldn't know what we searched. And then we have the second movement, 6 through 8, which is, you entail no contradictions which make you impossible. And this is, I'm trying to embody Anselm speaking to God. So 6 through 8 is, you entail no contradictions which would make you impossible. The third movement, 10 through 12, is, I cannot find reason for why you wouldn't relate to me. So we have an I, you, I. Because if God, and so the third movement's about how justice and grace can come together, and you see if justice and grace can't come together, then arguably God couldn't relate to human beings because we are quote unquote wicked or finite. So the third movement is impossible because this is where Anselm sees reason for why God could relate to us. The fourth movement, now what's also interesting is starting in chapter 12, we've had these meditations dividing the movements up. But here, I think the transitions become weaker and more difficult to determine, which arguably makes sense because we're going to be talking about how God is not bound by space. So the fourth movement, 13 through 15, you can say is, you are unbound, and so we must be relating, and yet I don't perceive us as relating because you transcend thought. So there's this idea where Anselm's like, well, I've concluded that we must be relating with God. He's unbound, and also his grace and justice can go together, so we can be relating, and yet I don't perceive him, so what's going on? The fifth movement, 16 through 18, is, I cannot approach you or sense you, and if I try, I fall back into darkness. And yet you must be there, for you are not bound by space, unless perhaps you are bound by time. So there's this, so Anselm's like, we must be together because you're not bound by space, and yet I can't approach you. So what's going on? And then the sixth movement, 19 through 21, is, you are in eternity in all moments at the same time. I cannot think you don't exist, and you, totally unbound, must entail you and I together. And so I cannot not think we are together. So there was this possibility of God being separate from us because he was separate in time, but then Anselm's like, no, that can't be the case. We have to be together in time as well because God is in eternity, so we must be relating somehow. And this is what's interesting because I think as of chapter 15, there's actually a kind of ascent toward God, and there's a kind of movement forward, but God has to do the initiation because we can't move toward him because we're finite. And we can see chapter 22 as a meditation on what God must be, which gathers up together all the previous sections which lacked transitions, I think movements 3 through 6. The heading of chapter 22 is that he alone is what he is and who he is, which suggests an individuation and separation of God, and yet we just suggested that there are no divisions in God. Thus, we must somehow be part of that aloneness somehow, even though we are not fully part of God because he has distinction. We cannot not believe in God, and thus we cannot not believe we are somehow incompletely part of God. And then the seventh movement, which I think marks this ascent, is, you are a we, and we should, the Trinity, as we should expect, because many goods together are better than one good as itself. Since you are a we can be part of you, as indeed we must be, given that you are not bound. And so, God's a Trinity. That means he's a one as many. That means it's possible to imagine us somehow participating in God, because clearly manyness or multiplicity does not break God apart, as the Trinity shows. So there would be reason to think that we could participate in the Trinity. And then chapter 26 is the quote-unquote capstone. Anselm started chapter 1 telling himself to leave behind the concerns for a little while. And now Anselm begs God to tell his soul, rather, this is that joy which God tells us about through his Son, because Anselm is now meditating on the joys of God. And what's interesting is now Anselm's praying that God would let his soul hunger for what God has taught him. God answered Anselm's prayer, but now Anselm has to pray to sustain what Anselm has been given. Fortunately, God is blessed forever. And so there's this eternal joy that you have in chapter 26, which, Anselm cleared his mind in chapter 1, and he's climbed premise by premise, one thing following from the other to a place of eternal joy. So you have an ascension here that only, though, could really begin after Anselm accepted his insufficiency, or his insufficiency was made clear in chapter 18. Putting this all together, I think we can summarize the 7 movements as follows. I cannot think you are not real, and you entail no contradictions. I have no reason to think you wouldn't relate to me, not held back by justice or power, and you are unbound by space and time. So in fact, we are already relating. Because of finitude, I cannot perceive this, but I also can know that because the Trinity is possible, it is possible for you to be many and one. As is to be expected, because many as one is better than one as one or many as many. Thus, there is hope for me to relate to you more fully, even if never completely, but only if you will let me. So God, I pray, let me. So section 2 there gives us an overview of Anselm's project. And so we can see where Anselm has arguably established that God is an internally consistent concept, that God could exist. Now again, what's so interesting is if Anselm has argued that part of God's internal consistency is the fact that he does exist, that he necessarily exists. So this is where it's so strange, and this is why, what Anselm does kind of haunts us. We can imagine, say, a pizza or a building as not existing, or not existing now and coming to exist, or so on and so forth, whereas God must always exist. He is the ground of his all being. We cannot imagine God coming into existence. He just is or isn't, one or the other. Now, again, I would say that if we ask the question, must the coherent concept of God correspond with actuality? Indeed, just because God cannot not exist, it doesn't mean this necessarily existing being necessarily corresponds with something in actuality. That's a different step. But the concept itself must maintain a coherence and be thought of as necessarily existing. So that's why the concept of God is so strange, is you can't meaningfully think about God as not existing, and yet at the same time, God may not correspond. You just can't think it. You just can't think God doesn't exist, even if God doesn't exist, which is very, very strange. I think it can help to think of God kind of like mathematics. We don't see the number 2 walking around anywhere, and yet 2 + 2 = 4. Seems to help describe the world. It seems to help us organize ourselves in the world. Math is unreasonably effective. And yet, there's this open question on if math is created or discovered. Do we create math or do we discover math? And it's a really, really big question. Arguably, if we think 2 + 2 = 5, we're not even thinking about mathematics. We're thinking about a fantasy that we call mathematics. We're only thinking about math if we think about things that follow, like 2 + 2 = 4. Well, similarly, we're not thinking about God unless we think about God as existing, because existing is part of the very fabric of the concept of God. And yet we don't see God walking around. But, sociologically speaking, God is an extremely useful, unreasonably useful concept, because societies organize themselves around God. God seems to have some very important roles in regard to ethics, morality, and things like that. So there's something unreasonably effective about God, in the same way that there can seem to be something unreasonably effective about mathematics. And you see, for Anselm, as a fool says 2 + 2 = 5, so a fool says God doesn't exist, because God is a concept that must exist. So that's where Anselm kind of has you here, in a very interesting predicament. Because he has made a case of how God could exist, and if he could exist, then God is worth thinking about, because he could exist. But if you think about him, you have to think about him as real, and yet the fact that you have to think about God as real is not a trick, really, even though it kind of feels like a trick, because it reasonably follows given the possible concept of God. That's what's so strange about this. But again, I think it's important to get a grasp on, because it really kind of shifts what we should think about as epistemologically the case or possible. I think Anselm has very big epistemological consequences. And also, it will impact how we think about theology and what we're doing and how one should think about theology and what it means to engage in theology. And again, like I said, math is entirely coherent, but it may not correspond. Math may be created. It might not be discovered. And yet there's something about math that just feels like it has to be discovered. And yet it may not be. Well, there's something similar with God. God is a completely coherent concept following Anselm, and yet God, who necessarily must exist in thought, may nevertheless not correspond to actuality, and yet we cannot think it. Often people will say God is an entity we cannot think about, but what's strange is Anselm gives us reason to think that God's non-existence is what we cannot think about. Because if we're thinking about a non-existent God, it's the equivalent of thinking 2 + 2 = 5. We're not thinking about God, we're just thinking about a fantasy that we call God. That's the crazy move that Anselm is making here. Section 4, to kind of expand on 3 there, is going to talk about God. So it starts saying that God is an unthinkable entity. We cannot think of as not existing, for we cannot think of God to think of God as not existing. This is where you put together 2, 3, and 5, chapters 2, 3, and 5. So God is an entity you cannot think about. And yet God, because he is in fact an entity, exists, and we cannot think of him as not existing. But then, of course, if we cannot fully experience God, how could we ever encounter something that we could meaningfully say is God or is not God? This is really strange. And also, too, we need to make some distinctions where I can think of the tooth fairy as not existing. I can think of Santa as not existing and not violate the internal consistency of the concepts of tooth fairy or Santa. But I cannot think of God as not existing and not violate the internal consistency of God. God either is or isn't. There is no possibly existing or not possibly existing. Possibility does not apply for God. And so, consider the following that this section is going to get into. It is possible for an entity to exist which cannot be thought, for existence doesn't have to come from thought, but being itself. So the first premise here is that it's possible for there to exist an entity which cannot be thought, because it is not the case that a thing must be thought to exist. It just has to exist, right? The second point, it is possible for an entity to exist which can never fully be thought. A thing which cannot be fully thought is thus such because of greatness. If a simple thing cannot be thought, it's only such because it is hidden or unknown, while God is ultimately unknowable because God is transcendent. And by simple there, I just mean lacking complexity. I don't mean simple in the theological sense. So it is possible an entity could exist which can never be fully thought. Next point, for an entity to be not fully knowable, it would have to be the source of its own being. For if other entities gave it being somehow, say by extending it thought or helping compose it, then the entity would be fully knowable. And of course, God, to be God, cannot be fully knowable. He can only know himself. The fourth point, it is possible for an entity to exist that is the source of its own being in this way, in that it is an entity of which cannot be thought and yet nevertheless is an entity. Thus, it is. There is no absolute law of nature that says that it is impossible for an entity to exist that cannot be thought, though it might, precisely because it is so great, though it might be incredibly rare. After all, the universe seems to have come from nothing, so why can't you have a thing of which can be the ground of its own being, simply because of its greatness? Why can't you have such a thing? The fifth point, thus we can imagine an entity which cannot be proven or disproven because of its greatness. We cannot fully think of that entity directly, but we can consider it generally and according to attributes as we have here, say in Anselm's project. And the final point, if everything which could exist does exist, God exists, though we'd have to be God to determine if this was the case. Only God can disprove God. So it's interesting because there, again, is nothing in the concept of God that must necessarily be false. Therefore, God could exist. And there's 2 ways to go about this. You can try Mojo Logic, which says if it could exist and it's a necessary thing that could exist, and it does exist. Mojo Logic, I'm not sure if it works beyond coherence to the realm of correspondence, but I do think it works in terms of coherence, which is very interesting, thus changing how we must relate to God. Or we can also make the argument that if everything that could exist does exist, well, then God would exist. But that I'm not sure if that necessarily follows. So you have a very interesting structure of which is possible, and that Anselm would suggest only the word God can meaningfully refer to. So God alone could be described, but by that list of points that was made. And if we take seriously this radical otherness that we can entail of God, of being this non-thinkable entity, that being comes entirely from his entity-ness, that we can't extend him any being with thought. I think we can start to understand some of these kind of paradoxical language that you see in Anselm, unapproachable light. He's this music we can't hear, this fragrance we can't smell. And we see this a lot in mysticism, theology, this kind of paradoxical language, which is kind of strange. I think a way to understand it, there's a few things. One, we can turn to Dante Paradiso chapter 5, which Dr. William Wilson brings up, where Dante describes the sun as when it's at its brightest, there's that mist that comes up that kind of conceals the brightness. And what Dante is trying to say is that God in his glory is so bright that actually it's grace for him to conceal himself. That one of the reasons God is hidden is precisely for us, because we would be overwhelmed and destroyed. Really, I think there's a part where Beatrice talks about smiling too much and reducing Dante to ash, like Simile in Zeus, I think with Zeus in Greek, that mythology. But there's a similar thing where God has to conceal himself so that he doesn't overwhelm us, because he's an unthinkable entity. He is the ground of his own being, and we can't even really comprehend that. Similarly, we have to use, so he's an unapproachable light. He kind of has to be in being an internally consistent system. And then the language of this unapproachable light, this kind of paradoxical language, is necessary for us to wrestle with the concept of God in order to really get what it's like. And there are people who say have near-death experiences that talk about this all-encompassing light, this transcendent light. There will be people trying to describe their love, and they'll use this poetic language. And there's something about poetry, which precisely in being an imprecise language per se, actually somehow becomes more precise, because you're trying to put into words something that just transcends words, which that in of itself kind of sounds iffy or kind of weak. Oh, this thing that transcends language. But when you really get that entities can be the ground of their own being, that they can be and yet be unthinkable, because if I never thought about this bookcase, it would still be there. But it is theoretically thinkable. God is just a thing like that bookcase, but he's also not theoretically thinkable per se. He's transcendent of all categories. Well, to really get at that, you're going to have to use kind of poetic language, indirect language that you wrestle with. It's precisely because you don't get at it immediately that you can wrestle with it in a manner that helps you get at the subject better. And you see, also, Anselm's going to describe how if God is ultimately unthinkable, following chapter 15, then we have to know God kind of by his aspects. I think Augustine will talk about knowing God, the sun, by the rays of light. We can't look at the sun directly, but we can look at the rays of light, and if rays of light exist, then therefore the sun must exist. And looking at the rays of light is the most we can get at the sun. And I think if I were to formulate what Augustine's thought there, but also Anselm's, we could say the following. X is unthinkable and unexperienceable. Y is thinkable and experienceable. Y is only possible because of X, thus Y proves the existence of X. So, if you can experience something in finitude that could only exist because of something of which cannot be fully comprehended, then you actually prove the thing that cannot fully be comprehended, precisely because you successfully prove that Y must be a result of that thing, and that it must be an aspect of that thing. So, for example, in some other text that Anselm does, Monologion, I can't say that either, he's going to argue how, in order for justice to exist, there has to be the perfect idea of justice. He's going to go through metaphysics, and I won't go through all those arguments, basically to say that in order for, say, beauty, justice, goodness, we could talk, maybe some of the Lewis arguments, some of the parts from Peter Kreeft, all of these suggest that there must be a God. And justice can only exist because God exists, therefore God exists. And, moves like that. Now, whether you follow those moves or not, that's a different question. And of course, can you really get from, say, this kind of general understanding of God or general proof of a general God to like a Jesus or a Krishna? Perhaps not, but all the same, Anselm has, I think, at least provided kind of a structure by which to think of how one would begin to approach God. All other entities are thinkable. Every other possible entity is thinkable, while God is the only entity which is unthinkable in theory or practice. That means God is the only source of God's existence, for we cannot give God existence with our thoughts. But that would also mean that in order to think of God, we have to consider his aspects or manifestations of which we can handle in our finitude. So it's also interesting because if God has to do all of the reaching, then in what sense can we reach for God? And it would kind of suggest that we don't have free will. And part of this section is going to get into the topic of free will a little bit, just simply to show that you can have an involvement of free will here, because you can freely say, for example, acknowledge that you can't find God on your own, and thus freely open yourself up for God's grace to fill you. So you can kind of negatively choose God, in a sense. Another way to look at this is if you're in a room full of smoke and you have an empty jar and you take the lid off. Well, the smoke can't help but go into the jar, but taking the lid off of the jar is not an act that necessarily means smoke's going to fill the jar. If I was in a room without any smoke and I took the lid off, it's not like smoke would appear in the jar, right? You have to be in a place where smoke is everywhere in order for the act of taking the lid off to be the act of which has smoke come in. Well, likewise, God is everywhere. God's grace is all-encompassing. He's always trying to reach us. So a negative act, such as just opening ourselves up to God, will seem like an active act, but that's just because God is everywhere. Where God is everywhere, then there's kind of like not much of a practical distinction between passive involvement and active involvement. An emptying act, a kind of negative act, is practically the same of an act as an active act. And I think this is why the issue of free will and grace can be so confusing, because it's like practically they're indistinguishable, even if technically they are not the same. I think the technicality is important to keep in mind, though, because we do want to emphasize how it's really God reaching for us, that we can't reach for him at all. And again, if God is unknowable, how can we even begin to rightly understand God or the effects of God? And again, I just submit that this is where all this kind of paradoxical poetic language can be helpful, because it keeps you in a state of wrestling in your mind to kind of approach God, but you never stop wrestling, because how can you ever be sure that you understand what the phrase silent music means, for example, or a fragrance that you can't smell? Like, how do you ever finish thinking about that? And that again might sound strange, but I've never seen the number 2 walking around. I've never seen mathematics directly. The symbols of mathematics are necessary for the understanding of mathematics, and we don't go, oh, these symbols don't have correspondence, therefore they're not real. We understand that the symbols are necessary for mathematics. Well, in a similar way, the poetic language is necessary for theology, because the subject of theology is an entity that can only be known through such paradox, because of us, not because he's trying to be difficult, but because because we are finite, God is infinite, and if he unveiled himself directly and clearly, it would destroy us. And the very fact that God is like that is justified by Anselm's work. We should expect God to be like that, because the concept of God to be internally consistent must be an entity of which so transcends a direct finite understanding. Chapter 6 is going to emphasize that, Anselm has established that a thing could exist, which perceives without senses, that a thing could be omnipotent, which couldn't do everything, and so on. He's explored the concept of the Abrahamic God and found nothing in it which couldn't be thus. In accomplishing this, the force is maintained of Anselm's move to make God a being who none greater can be thought, a necessarily existing being. Nothing about God can't be the case, and if we aren't thinking of God as real, we aren't thinking about God, and since God is internally consistent, God can't not be. Now, again, no, I don't believe from this that we can necessarily say God corresponds with an actuality. It's true that God could only be thought of as real, but that can only be the case even if the concept of God doesn't correspond with actuality. Now, that's illogical. So this is what's weird. This is where Anselm's kind of fascinating. I mean, it's illogical to think God doesn't exist, but I'm not sure if it follows that what is illogical can't be true. So here's the thing. Arguably, and Anselm has succeeded to argue, that it's illogical to think God doesn't exist. In order to discount Anselm's proof, we basically have to say that it doesn't follow that what is illogical cannot be true. Well, that would mean there's a break between the logical and the true. And I know this sounds crazy, which is precisely why I think Anselm gives us good reason to take God seriously. You see, that's what's kind of nuts. I mean, that's what's kind of wild about what Anselm, I think, has accomplished, is that he has made it illogical not to think that God is real. But of course, it is possible that what is illogical could be true. But here's the thing: if it's logical to think that God is real, then it would be logical to get on our knees, just like Anselm would have us do, to treat God as if he's real. And then if the concept of God is internally consistent, then once we get on our knees, per se, we would have no reason to leave. He's got us. We're stuck. And the fact, though, that we can map this out and understand that we're stuck kind of means Anselm forces us to acknowledge the conflict of mind that is described in the trilogy, The Truism of the Rational, and the inescapability of Kierkegaard. Now, again, the other paper on why Anselm haunts us will elaborate on this. Again, if we're thinking of a God that isn't real, we're not really thinking about God. And if you're thinking about God, you're going to be on your knees because the concept of God is so powerful. And he's going to tell us if we're thinking about a God that doesn't exist, we're thinking about more so the Word than we are about God. And he also thinks God is simple in the sense that it's easy to understand that God must necessarily exist, that the existence is part of the concept of God. Now, what's also interesting about this is it kind of suggests an observer effect of some kind, which is like if you think about God as being real, that changes how you experience God and thus makes him real or makes it more plausible to you that he's real. Whereas if you think God isn't real, then you act in a way that makes it thus. And he's tracing that out. And that would all suggest a Kierkegaardian leap of faith where you just have to commit to one side or the other. God is or isn't. There's no possibility. It's either the case or it's not the case. And Anselm would have us realize that. And, faced with this existential anxiety of realizing we either have to be all in or all out, we might be tempted to turn to arguments on how, omnipotent beings can't create rocks they cannot lift or other concepts. But, and that's why Anselm did his whole project. He's robbed us of those exits from the existential pressure. There's no exit. We must choose. But if we fall to our knees, considering 2, 3, and 15, chapters 2, 3, and 15 together, we will have reason to stay there and maintain a bowed orientation to God. Stuck here, though, at least Anselm's going to give us an ascent, starting with the fifth movement. So arguably, Anselm has made it epistemically irresponsible not to get on our knees. And to treat God as existing. But if we do that, that will necessarily orient us to the world in a manner that will make God seem like he exists. So that could be called brainwashing if you wanted. You could say that's kind of indoctrinating people into a conspiracy theory. Maybe it is if the concept of God doesn't correspond with reality. But note how epistemic responsibility, following Anselm, would put one in this pitch and risk situation, to use that language from the conflict of mind, or how it would put you in the situation of confronting something that might just be an internally consistent system that you're trapped in, which would be like the Pandora's rationality that I talk about with Lorenzo. Look what Anselm has done. And so there's a revelation in Anselm that this sort of epistemological situation exists and can be the case. And arguably all of us have to choose what we're going to deal with. All of us have to choose how we're going to deal with it. And hopefully the truism of the rational has made the case that non-rationality is going to be necessary, that we can't escape it, and that it seems to be the only way to deal with rationality. And really, if Anselm has shown us where rationality in maintaining internal consistency relative to a concept can bring us, that would also suggest that autonomous rationality might be problematic. It might, that we can arrive at entire coherences that may not correspond. But then again, maybe it does correspond. And this is where I think we can see where Anselm takes us toward the end of his work, of his project, which is going to be a meditation on eternal bliss and joy. That section 7 of the paper is going to describe. So, arguably Anselm has forced us to our knees, and now we can never escape, but he offers us an ascension. After chapter 15, we have 16 through 18, we realize we can't climb toward God, what are we going to do? But then the rest after that is going to be an ascension. And so you have this in the sixth movement, 19 through 21, it makes it clear that God is in all time, so now we know that he's in all space and time, so he's with us. We're then told that God is a Trinity. He is one of many, and therefore it's possible for us to be part of him. And Anselm's also going to make this move again. I mentioned it earlier, where a goodness, a good that consists of many goods is better than a good that's just one good. And so he's basically suggesting a God who wasn't a Trinity would be less good than a God who was, and this God must be a Trinity or something similar. So the God that exists that must exist, if God exists, is Trinitarian, or at least some kind of multiplicity and singularity. And I will note here also how you're seeing this increasing particularization toward the Christian God at this point. Chapter 25, coming toward the end here, is going to tell us that God is a joy which transcends finite comprehension, the greatest of all possible joys. And what's curious is that Anselm seems to make a move. So consider this. A God of whom experiencing causes us joy is greater than a God of whom experiencing doesn't cause us joy. If joy is kind of a positive, a strength, then an omnipotent being would be a being of whom experiencing would create us joy. And we would also expect it to be the greatest of all possible joys. And also, if we follow section 3, and if we understand that the concept of joy is part of the internal consistency of God, then God has to be the greatest of all possible joys, and the God of which must exist must be a God of eternal bliss, one that experiencing would bring us the fullest of joys. Therefore, any concept of God that does not entail bliss, that does not entail joy, cannot exist, because that would contradict the internal consistency of God. To put it another way, God cannot not exist, following chapter 3. God, to be the greatest of all possible beings, must be a unified many, following the Trinity understanding, his Trinity argument. God must somehow entail us. God entails joy, and this joy cannot not exist. So, if Anselm has succeeded at making it epistemically irresponsible not to kneel and to think God is real, because God cannot not exist, Anselm at least ends his project, which what to me seems to be the entire goal, which is to show us the movement toward an infinite joy, toward a joy of which passeth understanding. If God exists, then there must be infinite joy. And I think this is a significant move, because it means any God which doesn't, like I said, entail a beatific vision is not possible. The most coherent idea of God is an idea that also entails a beatific vision, and so it is irrational to believe in God, which entails no bliss. This brings us to the place where Anselm wanted us to arrive. We've understood that God has to exist as for that concept to be meaningful. And if each premise follows from the last, going through his whole project, then the final premise that must be part of God's internal consistency is joy, an eternal joy. For Anselm, the only rational way to think of God is as existing, and it is only rational to think of God as bliss. Considering these two together, why wouldn't we get on our knees? Is not eternal bliss rational? Only God can give it to us, but he told us in Revelation he would. So that's another thing. It brings in the fact that God said, ask and you will receive, and etc. So, God gave us that power. Ask and you will receive. So it's not a violation of God's strength to follow that declaration, because it's one that God made and imposed on himself, possibly, if we want to use the language of imposed. So Anselm has just brought us to the place where, basically we just simply have to ask the simplest and easiest of all possible prayers, which is for the eternal bliss of God, of which the concept of God must entail in order to be itself. And that joy cannot not exist. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com. Please visit Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Anchor. All of these things, all follows, likes are greatly appreciated. And thank you so much for your time.